Have you ever seen the 1994 film called Junior, where Arnold Schwarzenegger gets pregnant and gives birth, of course, by C-section? Well, if you did, you probably grew up like me thinking that there was some way for science to allow men to get pregnant. Well, question no more. We have a man who got pregnant and gave birth in the UK, and he's not even the first one. So let's talk about the definitions of man and woman on this episode of Jake in a Box Podcast. Sorry for the delay in making episodes. My car broke down and I've been car searching, and it's really not a fun process. But now I'm just stuck at home alone with no car and nowhere to go, just all by my lonesome, all alone.
'Cause I'm all alone, there's no one here beside me. My problems have all gone, there's no one to deride me.
Alright, let's get into it. So a couple videos ago, I talked about how truth has kind of become subjective and how people feel like truth is relative to a certain person's thoughts or feelings. Since then, the main example I've given is people have started to think that the value of life is subjective depending on what other people think. Well, another major topic that people are starting to consider subjective is gender. So sex and gender used to be considered basically interchangeable words. A person with XY chromosomes was a man, and a person with XX chromosomes was a woman. But nowadays, the definitions of these words has started to drift farther and farther apart. Biological sex is still easy to define, it's still based on your DNA, your chromosomes. But gender has become a little more difficult to define. A tool that's been used to help show the difference is something that's called the gender unicorn. The gender unicorn has been used in schools to teach kids the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and your sex assigned at birth. It also differentiates between who you're physically attracted to and who you're emotionally attracted to, but I'm not going to get into that. So the main thing here is the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and sex assigned at birth. The easiest one is your sex assigned at birth. For the most part, you're either a male or female. The next easiest one is your gender expression, whether you have more feminine characteristics or more masculine characteristics, or some combination thereof. But the more difficult one is the gender identity. Your gender identity is, of course, the gender you identify as. And that's typically man, woman, or sometimes another gender. So gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex are considered three different things, and each person can kind of have any combination on those spectrums. If you're not used to this, I get it. It can be kind of confusing.
Mr. Krabs, I am so confused.
Yeah, it's a little confusing. Like I said, biological sex and gender expression are fairly easy terms to define, and it's pretty easy to see what those things mean. Gender identity, on the other hand, is a little more difficult. And the main problem I've had is that I've never really been able to find a solid definition for what that is. So here's my basic question. What is a man, and what is a woman? It feels like a very straightforward question, but in terms of the gender unicorn, it's kind of hard to define man and woman in a way that doesn't have to do with gender expression or biological sex. Take man, for example. A man can't be a person with XY chromosomes or certain genitalia, because that would be biological sex. A man can't be somebody who has masculine traits, because that would be gender expression. Plus, there are women who have masculine traits, and there are men who have feminine traits. And you can't really say that a man is just somebody who feels like a man or who identifies as a man, because that still begs the question, what is a man? You can't identify as something if you don't know what it is. So in order to identify as something, you need to know what it is first, right? Or what about all the other genders? A lot of groups are saying that there are even dozens of genders. In fact, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Network, has released a series of videos intending to educate children from ages like 9 to 12, saying that there are more than 100 gender identities. A person can even consider themselves genderless, meaning that it's possible to have a person who doesn't have a gender.
What?
So if all these genders exist among humans, what makes them exist? What are they? What does that even mean? We can't really understand what gender a person is if we don't understand what gender is. So defining gender is kind of a tough question, but let's get back to that later. Of course, one of the outcomes of society considering the definition of gender more fluid has been that there have been more and more people who have come out as transgender, which means that you were assigned one gender at birth, but over time you've identified as a different gender. Take Freddie McConnell, for example. He's been in the news lately as one of the first men ever to get pregnant and give birth to a child. I won't say much more, just take a look at the video.
Freddie McConnell is one of only a handful of men to have carried and delivered his own baby. While it may seem strange to some, to Freddie it should be a choice accessible to many more trans people. He spoke to Sky News about the experience.
I didn't ever get sort of recognised as a trans man who was carrying his own baby or who was pregnant. It's amazing, actually. People just thought I was a man with a beer belly.
He had to pause testosterone treatment and wait for the return of his monthly cycle.
For someone like me, transitioning unlocks a certain sort of comfort and settledness within yourself. It makes you feel whole. Being off it was very, very difficult. But being pregnant wasn't so difficult. So it's an interesting dynamic.
He's fighting to be the first person in the UK to have given birth and be registered as the child's father rather than its mother. Freddie knows there's still significant social and legal opposition to people like him being recognised as dads.
So yes, Freddie is one of the many men in the world who has given birth. Or at least his gender identity is male, even though his biological sex is female. So in order for him to get pregnant and give birth, he had to, in a sense, give up his male identity and let his body return to normal female functions. So then he could carry out his pregnancy, give birth, and then go back to considering himself a male. So keep in mind whether or not you can get pregnant is entirely dependent on your biological sex. It has absolutely nothing to do with your gender identity. A trans woman, for example, somebody who's a biological man who identifies as a woman, will never be able to get pregnant. So then that makes me wonder, if gender identity and biological sex are two totally different things, then why is it so amazing that this person got pregnant? I mean, it's basic science that only biological women can get pregnant, and if your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological sex, if they're on two different spectrums, then why do we care about a person's gender identity when they're getting pregnant or having birth? So what does it really mean to say that Freddie McConnell was a man who gave birth? Either way, you're saying a biological woman gave birth, and in this case it just happened to be somebody who identified as something other than a woman. But just like every other pregnancy, it was just a biological woman giving birth. So my point here is just to make sure you don't conflate the terms biological sex and gender identity, because they're intended to be used as two separate things. Here's another example, a genderless penguin.
Will you go penguin sledding with me? Sure, I guess.
Okay, well I don't know about penguin sledding, but I do know that the London Aquarium has a penguin couple who has recently had a chick, and they've decided that the chick is now genderless for reasons. So check it out.
Now, here's a rather unusual story. London Aquarium is embracing a very modern family. A 4-month-old Gen 2 chick, a penguin, is being raised by same-sex parents. It is the first penguin not to be assigned a gender at birth. Well, those at Sea Life London Aquarium say it is more natural for the chick to grow up genderless. Staff deciding not to give the chick a gender-based name, instead identifying it with a purple band.
Okay, so this is quite interesting. A genderless penguin. So here is that unnamed genderless penguin. So let's ask this basic question. How do they know that this penguin doesn't have a gender? If it's about its biological sex, then they would know the penguin's gender by its physical body. If it's about how the penguin acts, then how would they know at birth before the penguin has had a chance to act among the other penguins? If it's about how the penguin feels, then, well, as far as I know, we have no idea how to know how a penguin feels. The anchors in this news story are kind of just as confused as I am. They bring up their confusion with that aquarist who is taking care of this penguin.
I mean, it's not like boy penguins are playing football and girl penguins are doing the knitting or something like that.
Yeah, because it's interesting when you say assign gender roles. What gender roles can you assign to a penguin?
It's a serious question. If you can't assign gender roles to a penguin, and gender identity has nothing to do with biological sex, then how do you determine its gender identity at that point? What does it even mean for a penguin to have a gender identity? The point here is just that the lines are kind of blurred. There doesn't really seem to be a solid definition, or even a solid use, of gender identity. Yet this isn't being applied just to humans who believe that their biological sex is different than their gender identity, but it's even being used for some weird reason on animals. Because I guess if it can be applied to humans, then it can also be applied to animals?
Okay, I guess that makes sense.
So like I said, with all this stuff going on in the news lately, it really begs the question, what is gender? What is man and woman? I figure one of the best places we can go is to somebody who considers themselves transgender. So ContraPoints is a famous YouTube channel, and it's hosted by a transgender woman who's a fairly well-known activist and is literate on the topic. Alright, let's take a look.
Now, a more sophisticated radical feminist...
Okay, stop right there. A sophisticated radical feminist. I'm sorry, I just loved that part. Okay, sorry, roll the tape again.
Now, a more sophisticated radical feminist like Catherine McKinnon might argue that the essential thing is not anatomy, but a certain kind of power dynamic, womanhood being defined by sexual submission and objectification. Whereas a queer feminist like Judith Butler might want to place more emphasis on the performative nature of gender, and on the possibility of queering practices like drag to reveal its contingent and imitative nature. And a transgender feminist will more likely want to define womanhood in terms of a psychological state, perhaps a proprioceptive sense of belonging in a woman's body. So which of these definitions are correct? Well, all of them are, in a way.
Okay, so we're given a couple definitions that are correct in a way. It's based on biology, it's based on how you act, or it's based on how you feel. Those are essentially the three definitions that are provided, but they don't really always line up. Like I've said, what about a feminine man? Or what about somebody who is a biological man but feels like a woman? Or a biological woman who feels like a man but still has feminine characteristics? Alright, so let's keep watching and see how this YouTuber feels like this applies in the real world.
So which of these definitions are correct? Well, all of them are, in a way. We should adopt whatever definition makes the most sense in a given context. If we're advocating for abortion rights, it makes sense to take the biological view. But if we're talking about the way women are treated in public spaces, it might make more sense to take the performative view. We have to always try to understand a broad concept like gender in a given context. Now maybe you're not satisfied with this answer.
No, I'm really not.
You're thinking it's fine to have operational definitions of something for a specific purpose, but you want to know what gender is really. What does it really mean to be a man or a woman? Well, these are philosophical questions, and the defining feature of philosophical questions is that they have no final answer. Philosophy can only take you to the end of a cul-de-sac. It can help you understand the cul-de-sac, but that's as far as our little monkey brains can go. Once you reach the dead end, that's it. You're done. There's no more thinking you can do.
I'm sorry, what was that?
There's no more thinking you can do.
Again, please?
There's no more thinking you can do.
One more time?
There's no more thinking you can do.
One more time, just for good measure.
There's no more thinking you can do.
So again, 3 definitions presented. Biology, how you act, how you feel. Like I said, it can't be based on your biology because that's your biological sex. If that were the case, then transgenderism wouldn't be a thing. Because if you're a biological male, then you're a man. If you're a biological female, then you're a woman. If it's how you act, then that's more gender expression. Otherwise, in that case, you're saying feminine men who identify as men are actually women without realizing it. Or the same thing with masculine women. So that definition doesn't really work either. So that leaves us with how you feel, the psychological aspect. You're a man if you feel like a man, and you're a woman if you feel like a woman. And this can apply to any gender. This, in my experience, is the most accepted answer. But really, the ultimate answer given in this video is there really isn't an answer.
And the defining feature of philosophical questions is that they have no final answer.
So again, here's my basic question. What is a man and what is a woman? Can you define any of these genders? Or can you even define what it means to be genderless? So let's just stick with the definition of man again. You can't tell me that it's somebody with male genitalia or XY chromosomes because that's biological sex. You can't tell me that it's somebody with masculine characteristics because you can have a female with masculine characteristics. And there are even men who are feminine. You can't tell me that a man is somebody who feels like a man because again, how does somebody know what a man feels like if there's no definition for man to begin with? To know that you feel like a man, you have to know that you don't feel like a woman.
Man, I feel like a woman.
And lastly, one of the common things I've heard is that a man is a person who identifies as a man, but again, that's still begging the question. What is a man? It makes the definition of man meaningless in that case. That's like saying, I'm a penguin. Well, if you're a penguin, then what's a penguin? A penguin is a person who identifies as a penguin. And what about you? I'm a frackadoodle. What is a frackadoodle? Obviously, a frackadoodle is anybody who identifies as a frackadoodle. A frackadoodle could literally mean anything. So to say that somebody who identifies as a frackadoodle is a frackadoodle, but frackadoodle doesn't mean anything beyond that, anybody could identify as that. Plus, if a man is somebody who identifies as a man and a woman is somebody who identifies as a woman, but those words don't really have any definition beyond that, what's stopping somebody from identifying as both? It's just somebody who identifies as one, right? So you can potentially convince me that gender is fluid and that gender is on a spectrum, but in order to do that, you have to define what gender is. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Until then, there doesn't really seem to be a cohesive definition for what these terms mean, other than the traditional definition of it's based on your biology and your DNA. But it's becoming more and more of a trend for people to treat gender subjectively based on what a person wants and feels. So does gender have objective meaning in this case? Is there any concrete definition of gender that you can come up with? If you can come up with a definition, I'll read it on this show. Even if you disagree with the definition you provide, I'd love to see you take a stab at it. And if you do, don't forget that you can email me at jakeinabboxpodcast@gmail.com, and maybe I'll bring it up in a later show. I've got lots of other questions about the transgender issue, whether or not bathrooms should be based on your biology or your gender identity, how this affects feminism, how gender can change in a person over time. But I'm going to stick with this one question for now. Because to me, this one question alone presents a lot of problems with the whole idea of transgenderism. I'm definitely open to what people have to say about this. I just need a concrete and cohesive definition of what gender is. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But in the meantime, this was the 5th episode of Jake in a Box Podcast. Have a good night and stay classy. Hey, hope you liked the show on Jake in a Box Podcast. If you liked this episode, make sure you click the subscribe button below so that you never miss another video of Jake in a Box Podcasts.